Avviate il microfono.
Che ci parlerà in una giornata dedicata a lupi e cani, ci parlerà finalmente del gatto, che appartiene a quella categoria di cittadini cosiddetti si dividono quelli che hanno cani e quelli che hanno gatti, quelli che hanno i cani, quelli che hanno il gatto, e io sono quelli che hanno il gatto. Tra l'altro presenta tantissime problematiche che sono analoghe a quelle dell'ibridazione lupo e cane, sono molto meno studiate, quindi questo contributo io lo considero estremamente interessante anche come stimolo metodologico ad affrontare l'argomento. Grazie, buona presentazione.
Allora, I will change to English, I think. I must say I feel a little bit out of scope at this presentation about this wolf conference with my wildcat stories. But nevertheless, I hope that you will behave as politely as these police dogs with this cat and listen to me anyway. Yes, so the idea is that I present shortly the hybridization as a threat to the wild animals, but here I think Professor Ciucci has already said almost everything. And then I will briefly present how we monitor hybridization in Switzerland. And finally, I will show some simulation we did on how hybridization could evolve in future. So for cats, for wild cats, it's also said in the red list of the threatened species that wild cat is threatened by the domestic cats, and I would like to show you why this is considered as a threat. It comes from the fact that if wild cat on the left and the domestic cat on the right, if they mate, then the first generation hybrids will carry half of their genes from both parents. And if these hybrids again meet again with the wild cats, we get this introgression of domestic genes in the gene pool of the wild cats. And why is this an issue? It's because we have a mix of different evolutionary units, because you have to know the story about the cats. You see here on the map, actually I can show you the... It doesn't work. Well, it doesn't matter. So the domestic cats actually they descend from the African wild cats and not from the European wild cat. And from an evolutionary point of view, the domestic cat form is very new species, and it descends from the African wild cat. And the domestic cats were brought in the European regions through the Romans, the Roman times, only roughly 2,500 years ago. And this means that the domestic cats mostly carry genetic adaptations from their direct ancestors, the African wild cat, and also the adaptations to a life in proximity of humans. And so the genetic adaptations in contrast to the adaptations which the European wild cats developed over a longer time. And that's really the problem of this hybridization. And as Professor Ciucci already showed us, we have this different outcomes of hybridization which are possible. We have positive and negative effects. We have to see that hybridization can occur naturally in many species, and for example, in small isolated populations which are inbred, it could be a positive thing to hybridize with other species, because you can gain some genetic diversity, and it can even lead to adaptive evolution or speciation. So hybridization per se is not only a negative point, but as we've already heard before, the negative effects makes that we have to consider hybridization as a conservation issue, at least. So yeah, it can generate outbreeding depression, reduced fitness, reduced survival, loss of the local adaptations, and in the worst case, even genetic swamping or even genetic extinction. So all these possibly negative effects are particularly insidious. It's an insidious threat because they are mostly hidden. That's really the problem. Because in some cases, hybridization is really obvious, as here, but the genetic effects on the population usually are not that visible. For example, if you take the pictures of these cats, maybe you would spontaneously say on the left it's the wild cat and on the right the domestic cat. Well, far missed, these are both 50% wild cats. So we have the problem that we do not recognize hybridization in some cases. And that's why it's an insidious threat, because we might overlook it. And as was already said, Professor Tucci, the problem is the anthropogenic hybridization, because when domestic species are involved, we have this problem that we humans influence natural processes. For example, some domestic traits might not be so well adapted for a life in wilderness. So, for example, if you have these cats without hairs or short legs, or even worse, a combination of those, I guess all of these cats won't have a chance to survive one winter. But of course, this is a little bit a bad example, because these pedigree cats, these are not the ones that will be free-ranging and mating with wild cats. But we can also take some other traits, for example, the tolerance to the boldness, the increased boldness of the domestic animals, the reduced vigilance in front of predators, like dogs or humans. These can be traits that are present in domesticated species. And so this would be maladapted traits for life in wilderness. And in addition, we do keep a rather unnaturally high population size of domestic cats. So this also is a problem which does impede the natural selection against maladaptive traits. And these are the reasons why one should apply the precautionary principle just to avoid this potential threat. Meaning that we should keep the number of domestic animals low, and the regions where the wild species live, of course, and keep the numbers of wild animals numerous and healthy. And as long as we do not know what is prevalent, it is more positive or negative for the species, we actually don't understand the effects that really happen in nature. And as long as we do not know that, I think the one important point is to survey, to make a monitoring of the hybridization, to see what happens on the genes of these animals. And this is actually exactly what we are doing in the Swiss Wildcat Monitoring Project. This is a project which I managed in the last 2 years on behalf of the Federal Office of the for the Environment. The project started already 10 years ago with the first systematic sampling over the entire range of potential presence of wildcats. And here on the map, it's difficult to see, but there are some spots. We had a regular grid where we went to get some samples from wildcats in order to define the distribution, the density, and the hybridization in the wildcat population. And because the degree of the amount of hybridization within an animal is not really obvious and visible, we had to go through the genetic sampling. strong wildcat. And so we did apply a trick. The method was that we put some lure sticks within the wood, and we just sprayed some valerian on it because cats are attracted by the valerian, and then the cat can rub its fur against the stick, and then we can collect the hairs and analyze them in the lab one by one. And with some special designed markers, actually I needed 3 years to develop these special markers to be able to distinguish between wild cats and domestic cats. And if we know the markers, we can look for every hair, which kind of genotype it is, and with some probability calculations, we can determine the hybridization degree of each individual. Yes, and with that, the results are, these are the results for the distribution and density. We have this nice map, and we see that compared to 10 years ago, we had a massive increase of the population and also an extension, geographic extension. But actually, what's most interesting here for our topic today is the results about hybridization. And here we see that roughly 15% of the wildcats are hybridized to some degree. But here, as an evolutionary biologist, I prefer to use these values, which are a little bit theoretical and difficult to explain, but it's an amount for the gene flow between both genetic groups. And we see 0.033 migrants per generation from domestic cats to wild cats. But here, this value, the importance is to see that we have a much higher gene flow from domestic cats to the wild cat gene pool than the contrary. And I think we should also be careful with the interpretation of such values, because if we see a 0, we say it's low. And yeah, we can say 0.5 is low. But the question is it sufficient? What is the threshold? Is it sufficient to be harmful to the wildcats? And actually, at the moment, nobody will be able to say if it's a problem or not. But nevertheless, these colleagues of mine from the University of Geneva, Claudio Kilodran and Matthias Kücher, they did some interesting simulations based on the data that we observed in their first wildcat monitoring count. And you see that the scenarios in green, in grey, it's the scenario where nothing changes compared to the starting point. This means we have lots of domestic cats and very few wild cats. The yellow scenario is where we estimated wildcats and domestic cats are roughly at the same effective population size, and blue would be the scenario where wildcats do have higher population sizes than domestic cats. And the red one is just the control where there is no hybridization going on. And what we see here is that we can simulate a massive increase in hybridization over the next 100 years in these different scenarios. So this is quite alarming. But it's theory, it's a model, you can't put everything in it, and we don't know everything, every parameter. And especially we did these models without considering competition. And we repeated these models, and Claudio repeated these models by calculating also a competition advantage for the wildcat. It's quite logical. We can assume that animals living in the wild have some competition advantage. And we take again these scenarios, and yeah, we see that the scenarios where wildcats are at the same number, higher the number than domestic cats, the increase gets quite lower. But so, hybridization makes me think that we at least should continue to say that hybridization is a conservation issue which we should survey. So, just to summarize my main messages, I think we have to see that hybridization is not bad per se. It can have positive and negative effects. But in the case of anthropogenic hybridization, we should be particularly careful and apply the precautionary principle. And to monitor the hybridization, it is necessary to have genetic samples, and it's important that it's representative to the whole population. And finally, we also saw that the population sizes of hybridizing species is really a crucial point for the dynamics of hybridization. Okay, with that, I thank first for the invitation to be able to talk here about cats in this wolf pack. And thanks to all the persons who financed the Wildcat project and who collaborated with me for the Swiss Wildcat Monitoring. And thank you all for listening.